は。今日はお越しいただきましてどうもありがとうございます。私、ダイオキシン環境ホルモン対策国民会議の本日は3人の先生方にスライドを使って発表をいただくんですけれども、スライドは後日国民会議のホームページに掲載をいたしますので、他の方の邪魔にならないようにその場でのスマホでの撮影等はお控えいただきますとありがたいと思います。ではこれより、本日の国際新報を開催したいと思います。まずは国民会議代表の、中下優子より一言ご挨拶申し上げます。
皆さんこんにちは。国民会議の代表を司って務めさせていただいております中下と申します。本日は、お忙しい中多数お集まりいただきましてありがとうございました。冒頭少しだけ時間いただきまして、私どもの国民会議の紹介をさせていただければというふうに思っております。私どもダイオキシン環境ホルモン対策国民会議は1998年9月に、設立をされました。で設立にあたりましては女性弁護士158名が呼びかけ人になりましてさまざまなジャンルの専門家の方々、学際的なご起任の方々50名とともに、設立をいたしました。その当時は、今日おいでになっておられる、マイヤーズさんがお書きに共著者の一人であります奪われし未来という本、これは日本では環境本にしては、大変ヒットした30万部ぐらい売れたというふうに言われていますけれども、そのような本がですね、たくさん売れている中で、皆さん関心も高く、ほとんど毎日のようにダイオキシン環境ホルモンというようなタイトルのついた記事が新聞を賑わしているというような状況の中でしたので、私たちがスタートした時はそういう意味では大変恵まれた環境の中で私たちはこの問題についての解決策を具体的に提案していくと政策提言グループとしてスタートいたしました。そして今日に至るまでさまざまな提言をしてきております。一つ一番最初にやったダイオキシン対策については特別措置法が議員立法で成立しまして、私たちとしては幸先の良いスタートで我々がロビー活動した結果、立法化に結びついたというところでですね、大変意気揚々としていたわけですけれども、残念ながら、2003年ぐらいからですね、最終的には2005年に環境省は私たちがスタートするよりも少し前の98年の5月にスピード98という環境ホルモン研究計画というのを策定しました。環境省にしては素早い動きだなと私たちも評価をしておりました。ところが2005年になってですね、その時に87物質の環境ホルモンリストというのを、提案しました環境省が。ところが2005年にですねイクステンドを2005に改定いたしまして、このスピードをやめてイクステンドにしたんですけど、イクステンドっていうとなんか拡大だっていうふうにイメージしますが、それとは程遠く実は環境ホルモンリストも下げ、一般的な化学物質の問題のような形にし、しかも環境省の、研究範囲というのを野生生物に限定するといったような私どもからすると改悪としか思えないような、政策変更が行われました。その背景には、皆さんも想像しておられる通りですが、産業界の反撃があります。バックラッシュです。でそういう中で環境ホルモンという言葉がもう今日死語になってしまいました。ほとんど知ってる方はおられないというような状況になるし、なんかもうそれは終わった問題でしょ、マスコミの方に言うと環境ホルモンっていうのを出すのはもう古いからダメですよというなんて記事にもならないというようなが残念ながらですね、その後現状であります。でそれは私どもの運動の弱さであるし、私たちがそのことを伝えきれなかったという、一つの敗北だったのかなというふうに思います。でも問題は終わっていない。今日はその話をしていただきます。問題は決して終わっていない。むしろ研究の現場からは次々と新しいことが分かってきている。 スタートした時は「奪われし未来」という本を読まれた方はお分かりかと思いますけれども、その頃は野生生物の異変が中心でした。でその時に人にも影響が及ぶかもしれない、まだ証拠はないけども危ないよということで「奪われし未来」という警告の書が出版されたわけであります。ところがその後20年間を経て、人への影響ももう科学的に証明されつつあります。人へ影響が及んでいることは、皆さんこのところの、アレルギーが増加しているっていうのはもう皆さんご存知の通りですけど、最近著しいのは発達障害の増加です。もう著しい増加です。私は仕事をしておりますが、弁護士を始めた時には発達障害かなとか思われる方はほとんどいらっしゃいませんでした。今私は家事の仕事をしておりますと、ご夫婦間のトラブルの当事者のお一人が大体ひょっとしたら環境ホルモンじゃないかな、発達障害じゃないかなっていうふうな疑いを私が抱いてしまうような方です。そして日常的ないろんな殺人事件とか起こっておりますが、その背景にひょっとしたら加害者の方が発達障害だったんではないだろうかというふうに思われる事件が相次いでおります。で皆さんもきっとそれは日頃感じておられることだと思いますけれども、私はそれも一つの化学物質による影響、一つの要因としてですね、化学物質によるものがあるのではないかというふうに思っております。そういう意味でこの問題は解決していません。それどころか研究してることはとても必要ですけど、それだけではもう足りない状況にまで今日来ているんじゃないかというふうに思っているんですけれども、残念ながら日本では動きがありません。マスコミもなければ政府もやろうとしません。特にもう安倍政権になってからは最悪で、環境は環境政策は一つとして進んでいない。残念ながらそういう状況です。はい、時間ですのでって言われました。いろいろ言いたいことありますが、それでも EU では環境ホルモン規制がもう始まってます。現実に規制の段階に EU ではもう行ってるんです。日本も遅れは取ってはならない。なぜならばこの問題の最大の被害者はまだ生まれてもいないもの言える子どもたちだからです。という意味で今日の集会を私たちは企画をいたしました。もう一度環境ホルモン問題は終わってなどいない。そしてこの問題は今生命科学の最前線に近いことが分かってきています。エピジェネティクスという、今日後から少し説明があるかもしれませんが、あるいは同伴と仮説であるとか、その今の生命科学の最前線の問題と非常に関係が深い問題でありまして、科学者の方にもぜひ理解をしていただき、さまざまな分野でこの問題を再提起していただきたい、問題提起をしていただきたい。そうして日本の中で大きな環境ホルモン問題の解決を求める、これから生まれてくる子どもたちの未来を守るための対策を求める、そういう運動の今日があの時が出発点だったねというような内容の集会にできればというふうに望んでおりますので、ぜひ最後までお聞きいただければと思います。ちょっと講師の方は後で紹介されると思いますけど、ピート・マイヤーさん、今申し上げたような奪われし未来を書かれた共著者のお一人、それからトラサンデさんは実は新しい世代の今旗振り役リーダーであります。環境ホルモン問題の小児科医でいらっしゃいまして、非常に政治的にもいろいろ動きをしていらっしゃる頼もしい方です。そしてもう一人日本からの中山先生も国関係で今エコチル調査の、担当していらっしゃる先生で、日本における新しいニュー研究者のリーダーの誕生であります。そういう方々をお招きをしておりますので、ぜひ最後まで勉強していっていただければと思います。どうもありがとうございました。
レオナルド・トラサンデ先生にお話を伺いたいと思います。トラサンデ先生、どうぞ壇上の方にお越しください。世界にいらっしゃって、現在はニューヨーク大学医学部で環境小児科部門の責任者、小児科研究部門の副部長を務められています。またニューヨーク大学ワーグナー校等でご教鞭をお取りになっています。トラサンデさんは欧州とアメリカにおいて環境ホルモンが原因となって引き起こされている病気の社会的費用が算定されたことで有名で、先ほど中瀬代表からもご紹介ありました通り、子どもの健康と環境の 問題について国際的に活躍する気鋭のリーダーでいらっしゃいます。トラサンデ先生は最近SickerFatterPoorerという、ご本を執筆されたんですけれども、現在日本語版の出版に向けて準備をされているということです。出版されたらぜひ読んでみたいと思いますが、今日はまずその本の内容についてもご紹介いただけるということで楽しみにしております。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
すみません。少し日本語を話します。It's a privilege to be here today to speak about the leading challenge, a challenge that I argue is the second leading environmental challenge that we face today, and it arguably is as urgent as addressing climate change. So allow me to introduce you first. Sure, of course. This is even better. So some of you may have come to this conversation wondering why we didn't know about endocrine disrupting chemicals. Why are we only learning about this now here at the end of the second decade of the 21st century? A reason for that is that we have experienced a history of using and being an even more productive society through the use of synthetic chemicals in all aspects of life. As you see in the middle of the slide is a cover from Time magazine where a leader in DuPont, a gentleman by the name of Copeland, was a leader in bringing this multinational corporation great profit and great productivity from the introduction and development of plastics. And as you can see on the left and on the right, you can imagine the many benefits that plastics were being presented in the eyes of the public at the time. On the right, you see a newborn baby in a lucite plastic bassinet. Even in my own pediatric training, and still in my clinical career, I see little newborn babies in these plastic bassinets. And at the time, these plastic bassinets brought the promise of easier cleaning, reduction of microbial infections, which can be devastating to a newborn who is just developing an immune system. So there were many benefits that were perceived to be obvious with the introduction of newer chemical products and chemically intensive manufacturing. On the left, you see a plastic cup that offered the benefit of being able to fall on the floor without breaking and an easy cleaning process as well in the process of using that for drinks and even food. So we were brought into the mindset that chemicals were not bad for our health. They actually improved our health and overall well-being. And so that's the mindset in which we come to understanding the effects of chemicals on human lives today. Now, we did have some warnings that chemicals were not all good for us. The woman on the left is really a scientist who I never had the benefit of meeting, on whose shoulders, to borrow a phrase from Albert Einstein, I have the privilege of standing on today in my own research. Rachel Carson was brave when she first described the effects of a pesticide that was used widely. You see a child on a beach somewhere in the United States literally running in the mist of DDT because the presumption was that this chemical would eliminate malaria, a very deadly vector-borne illness across the world. I had the privilege a few years ago of working for then Senator Clinton. She writes about running in this mist herself as a child growing up, and that again was thought to be okay, but we now realize that these chemicals not only affect wildlife, as Rachel described so beautifully in her book Silent Spring, but we now realize that DDT is associated with an increase in humans of a risk for breast cancer. And so this was our first warning sign that there was something potentially wrong with the broad and widespread development of chemicals in our daily life, that it wasn't all for the better for our human health. The second warning flag was more specific. Originally, Carson wrote about the impact of pesticides on our wildlife. The effect of DDT on human health was only described very recently with respect to breast cancer and other consequences. The first warning flag of endocrine disrupting chemicals and their impact on human health came from a pharmaceutical. Diethylstilbestrol was introduced in the 1930s as a synthetic estrogen drug that was a wonder drug because estrogen prolonged pregnancies, prevented prematurity, and was thought to actually improve the symptoms of a mother of nausea and other consequences that come with pregnancy. Now, a few years after diethylstilbestrol was introduced, we realized that it wasn't as effective as previously described. But a few years after that, we realized that there were potential serious consequences associated with the use of this pharmaceutical. A very astute pediatrician and colleagues at the Massachusetts General Hospital described a cluster of young girls who had a cancer that had not been previously described in the history of the hospital or much in the literature at all, an adenocarcinoma of the vagina. And this team did a really wonderful and carefully described study in which they went back to the records of these children and the mothers that delivered these children, and then they matched those young girls with girls of a similar class, obesity profile, and other health information. And the only difference between the girls who developed this rare cancer and the girls who did not develop this rare cancer was the use of this pharmaceutical. This was a remarkable finding at the time. It took this study of 8 young girls, that was how small the study was at the time, to change our thinking fundamentally about the effects of this synthetic pharmaceutical and its impact on people's lives. And the good news is, at the time, that DDT and DES were identified as problems and set aside for their use. DDT is now banned under the Stockholm Convention. It's only used in certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa to prevent malaria in endemic areas. The argument for using DDT in those areas is that the vectors that distribute malaria can't be stopped without the use of DDT, and that's why we see DDT used in those very few places in the world. Similarly, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States banned diethylstilbestrol in 1971. Now, these are good examples where science leads to relatively rapid reaction to protect us all. So we thought we were safe again. at some level. That is a reasonable understanding based on how we understood the science at the time. And one reason we understood that we were safe is that we have a long history of thinking that the dose is the only thing that makes the poison. The gentleman in the odd picture in the middle is Paracelsus, a Swiss philosopher whose full name is Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheimhorn. That's the only time you'll ever hear me say that. But the reason I bring this Swiss physician's name to this conversation is that his perspective about toxicology is something that has carried the reality for 500 years. He lived in the 1500s. And even until very recently, even when I was a medical student at Harvard in the late 1990s, I was taught this principle. It's analogous to saying everything should be in moderation. A little bit of a poison might not be a problem, but a lot of a poison is a problem. And it's that mindset that pervades much of the conventional thinking across the world. That's why on the right, you see this picture. This comes from an organization called Sense About Science that likes to communicate about the effects of chemicals in our daily lives. And it makes the argument that, well, a little bit of synthetic chemical can't be bad for you because there are toxic natural chemicals in our daily life. And if you have a lot of these toxic natural chemicals, that can hurt you too. So it's about the dose. That's the only thing that makes the poison. So I bring this up to remind us that we've carried forward this paradigm in science for 500 years. And it's a credit, actually, to this gentleman in the middle, Paracelsus, that we've gotten this far. It has withstood the test of time for many, many years. Now, unfortunately, and this is like many scientific phenomena that we deal with, the reality is that we actually were not safe. So the case in point that really brings this issue home is a group of pesticides that were introduced into use in the 1950s in agriculture called organophosphate pesticides. The original thought was that these chemicals basically affected electrical discharges in the brains of roaches and other unwanted creatures in our lives. And because the human brain was more resilient, was able to deal with these low levels of exposure, and the pesticide did not induce these same effects as it did in lower creatures in the food chain, it was okay to use this chemical, this category of chemicals. Now, that was our original understanding, but now over the past 2 decades, we've realized that lower levels of these same chemicals disrupt thyroid hormone, the hormone that is fundamental to our metabolism, our maintaining healthy body temperature, even brain function. And in little newborn babies, thyroid hormone is a very important thing. I'm proud as a pediatrician that from the very first day that I was in the newborn nursery, we would check every baby's heel stick blood. We'd make the baby cry, though it was often not the heel stick, but the holding of the baby that made the baby cry. At least that's what we were told. But we would collect a few drops of blood, and we would test for a variety of genetic conditions, but also check for what we call congenital hypothyroidism. And that's a very treatable condition. It's very satisfying as a pediatrician the few times you identify a child with that concern, because you can give a child thyroid hormone, and you can prevent a child from having a lifetime of intellectual disability. Now, that's a gross dysfunction, a gross mistake in the way a baby's thyroid hormone is produced. And again, like what I said about Paracelsus, we assumed that only gross disruptions in bodily functions induced disease. But now we realize that during pregnancy, a newborn baby relies on mom's thyroid hormone production and function to develop the brain. And that's because the baby doesn't make thyroid hormone until the second trimester of pregnancy. And that disruption of thyroid hormone, even within the normal range of a mother's blood test, that is, if you're an obstetrician, you can't identify which mom is affected. Even subtle shifts in the normal range are associated with cognitive deficits, as well as even autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And that's where these pesticides and other chemicals are so important, because low doses of these chemicals, much lower than the levels that Paracelsus described, can disrupt thyroid hormone in early life. And in human studies, now we have 4 large-scale birth cohort studies in humans that have followed mothers and their children, and all 4 of them tell us the same story, that if you measure a child's cognitive potential at ages, let's say 5 or 6 or 7, the higher the mom's level of these pesticides in her body that she passed to the baby, the lower the child's IQ or intellectual quotient. It's the lower capacity for a child to produce in society and produce in our economy. And the picture below is a study based at Columbia University that also identified these children to have smaller parts in the brain that are crucial for these same higher order cognitive functions. Parts of the frontal and parietal cortex are smaller in the more highly exposed mothers. And so you have 2 different independent verifications of the same problem, that little things do matter. So we were not as safe as we originally thought. And the same is true, as I've described here, for a category of chemicals that also disrupt the thyroid hormone called flame retardants, chemicals that are used to stop the spread of fires. They're used in electronics and furniture. So there are a variety of other chemicals in our daily lives, chemicals that you can measure in people's blood or urine in the case of pesticides, that can give you these same kinds of consequences, even at low levels of exposure that we all experience in our daily lives. It's not only the brains of children that are affected by these chemical exposures. We now have evidence that chemicals can also literally make us fatter. There are some 50 so-called chemical obesogens, chemicals that in the laboratory or in humans can make us fatter. Now, nothing I'm about to say means that healthy diet and physical activity are the most important reasons for maintaining a healthy body weight. That's true. There is such a thing as calories in, calories out. But for example, bisphenol A, which is used in the linings of aluminum cans and thermal paper receipts, makes fat cells bigger. It actually tells cells in the body that have not yet decided what form they're going to take to go into fat cells as opposed to muscle or bone cells. It disrupts the function of a protein that protects the heart called adiponectin. And it's a synthetic estrogen, much like DES, but not as potent. The EPA was considered as a pharmaceutical back when DES was being brought onto market, but it wasn't potent enough the way DES was. It's an interesting and frightening comparison to make at some level. But that fact that it's a synthetic estrogen means BPA can have sex-specific effects on growth and development, especially during vulnerable windows of development like puberty. So it can literally reshape a developing child into having an unhealthier body composition. We also know that chemicals used in softer plastics, called phthalates, can disrupt how the body processes calories. So let's say you've had a healthy diet with a substantial amount of protein, you've gone for a run, gotten some exercise in. Phthalates can divert the traffic in your body, your metabolism, from making protein from muscle from that protein, and essentially move it into sugar or fat. Now, what's also a concern is that these chemicals can make us sicker, and they make us sicker in a few ways. One way they make us sicker is that phthalates are known to antagonize, inhibit the function of the male sex hormone, testosterone. Testosterone is crucial for sperm production, for libido, but it's not just a lifestyle issue. It, in some cases, is literally a life or death issue. We know that phthalates, by reducing testosterone, can contribute to what's called low testosterone levels. It's a clinical condition that's increasingly being recognized in adult men that is associated with heart disease and even stroke. And in the United States, we found that 10,000 men each year die because phthalates reduce their testosterone, pushing them into a higher risk profile for disease. So literally, this is not just a lifestyle issue, this is a life or death matter in some cases, and that's not making it too dramatic. We also know that when you contribute to disease, when you reduce the cognitive potential of children who are the economic engine of our society, you literally undermine our economic productivity and cost society. We did a series of studies about 5 years ago in which we put together the best experts we could. And we looked first at the costs of endocrine disrupting chemicals, their disease-related costs, first in the European Union and then in the United States. And what we found was shocking. I didn't expect the results that I'm about to describe to you. In Europe, the costs of endocrine disrupting chemicals are 163 billion euros each year. That's 1.2% of the gross domestic product. And as an American, I'm embarrassed by the fact that the costs of these chemicals in the United States are even higher. $340 billion a year. That's 2.3% of our gross domestic product. And so you might ask, well, why is the cost so much higher in the United States? That's because back in the 1970s, we put a law into place that required flame retardant chemicals, those chemicals that disrupt thyroid hormone, into every piece of furniture and upholstery because we wanted to prevent the spread of fires. And so that has produced a situation where if you measure 100 Americans, and I measured everyone else's blood here today, the levels of those who live their lives in Japan would be much lower than Dr. Myers and myself and our blood levels. Maybe I speak for myself and not for Dr. Myers, but suffice it to say that we have had a legacy where we lead the way in the United States in having the highest levels of flame retardants in our bodies of any country in the world. And as a result, our children in the United States are less well able to contribute to society and to our economy. So 240 billion of that $340 billion is due to flame retardants alone. And unfortunately, I have to tell you this, the costs in Japan are likely on the same order of magnitude, maybe not as high as the United States for the reasons I've talked about with flame retardants. But these are chemicals that are detected. Dr. Nakayama-san will talk about the Japan Echo Child Study and its plans to measure these chemicals and what it's already identified. But these are chemicals that are found in every human being on the face of the planet, even the most rural areas of the world where you think these chemicals might not arrive, they arrive there. And yet, the costs to society are based on an estimate of just less than 5% of endocrine disrupting chemicals. A subset of diseases due to the few chemicals we study. And a small part of the whole of all the costs of those diseases due to the few chemicals we study. So this is clearly an underestimate of an underestimate of an underestimate. And yet, it's 1.2 to 2.3% of the gross domestic product. So we really have a problem that for which we are barely touching the tip of an iceberg. Now, there's some good news. We already are starting to become aware, and we must learn this lesson as a public. The first report that really put this scientific issue on the map came from the Endocrine Society, a professional society of 17,000 endocrinologists from across the world. The Endocrine Society is an international organization from over 100 countries with membership. In 2012, on the right, the World Health Organization and the United Nations Environment Program acknowledged that endocrine disrupting chemicals are a global public health threat. In 2015, the Endocrine Society realized that there were 1,331 new scientific publications since the 2009 report, and so they decided to put a second scientific statement out. Most scientific societies don't respond that quickly with scientific statements. And then, I'm privileged to say that doctors are also speaking out. My American Academy of Pediatrics, that I'm proud to be a member of, I'm also a member of the Endocrine Society, in 2018 put a report out documenting the concern about synthetic chemicals that contaminate foods, intentionally through food packaging and unintentionally through other sources. And the International Federation of Obstetricians and Gynecologists has acknowledged this as a major threat. The Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists has acknowledged the need to take safe and simple steps to limit exposure. So there is an opportunity here for us to get the broader word out. I like to say that endocrine disrupting chemicals affect 100% of us. Yet right now, only 1% of us really know that this is an issue. You here in the audience probably represent that 1% today. So we must all rise up. I began this presentation by making a comparison to climate change. And it is not histrionic. It's not extreme to make that comparison. Even if we cool the planet, if we don't address the internal contamination with these synthetic chemicals, we will pass along a legacy in which our children will be sicker, fatter, and poorer. The picture on the left is from an American TV miniseries called The Handmaid's Tale. It's based on a book by Margaret Atwood by the same name from 1984. At the time, she wrote this book. It was fictional, but it was about a population where infertility was such a crisis that a totalitarian regime took over and essentially took women who were fertile and matched them with men who presumably were fertile with the idea of sustaining the population. And There were other consequences. I'm simplifying the story to a great extent. But that speaks to the urgency of the problem that could be ahead. Literally, we have synthetic chemicals, as Dr. Myers will talk about for sure, that are contributing to a decline in sperm count. These trends have declined across the world, especially in developing countries. So we are facing a primal threat, perhaps not as obvious as wildfires or as other phenomena associated with climate change. But we are seeing the imprints in chronic disease epidemics across the world that are raising the alarm. So what do we do? The great news is that as much as I have perhaps scared you or raised serious concerns, there are safe and simple steps we can all take to limit these exposures. And at the same time, we do need to advocate for policies and changes to limit these exposures of greatest concern. So here are some safe and simple steps that are based in the best available scientific evidence right now. We know, for example, that eating organic in multiple separate studies has consistently and rapidly reduced the levels of pesticides in the urine of young children. These are the same pesticides that I talked about earlier that are disrupting thyroid hormone and contributing to negative effects on the developing brains of young children. Similarly, avoiding canned food consumption has been associated with a steep and rapid decline in levels of bisphenols in the human body. In the United States, a lot of people have talked about replacing BPA and putting labels that say BPA free. There's a problem with that, however, and that's why I suggest avoiding canned foods across the board. A BPA free can often uses bisphenols, other bisphenols. There are 40 or so regrettable substitutes, or in the United States we describe it as artists formerly known as BPA. It's a nod to the rock star Prince. But putting my tongue in my cheek, if you will, I'll just continue on to say that BPS, BPP, BPF, BPZ are among the chemicals of concern. And what little we know about BPS is that it's as estrogenic, as toxic to embryos, and as persistent in the environment. So in many ways, by simply changing BPA for BPS, we are kicking the can, to borrow another idiom, I apologize, down the street. Similarly, we assume that microwavable plastics are safe for use. Unfortunately, that label is misleading because microwave safe really only refers to gross misshaping and warping of plastic. Unfortunately, the synthetic chemicals that are used in plastics are not always bound to the plastic directly. And in fact, they can break down. Polymers do break down into monomers and ultimately get into food and into the human body with the same consequences that I've talked about here today. Now, the message here is also about reducing the use of plastic fundamentally. We have a crisis of ecological and drastic proportions when it comes to the plastic that's in our water, in our fish, and in our daily lives that are essentially waste that has disseminated throughout the planet. Reducing the use of plastic helps reduce your exposure to chemicals used in plastic and also supports a broader problem that we are fighting. Finally, the good news is there are steps to reduce exposure to flame retardants and other persistent organic pollutants. Simply recirculating the air by opening the windows or using a wet mop can get rid of flame retardants and other chemicals of concern. I perhaps don't need to focus as much in this audience on the flame retardants because this is largely an American problem. But in case you are concerned There are even steps with older furniture to limit the exposure because the chemicals are sprayed directly into the upholstery of the furniture. So if it's torn or scratched, it's either time to get rid of that piece of furniture or to cover it with an appropriate slipcover. And just one comment about the effects of these endocrine disrupting chemicals that disrupt thyroid hormone. Iodine is a problem from the perspective of deficiency and can magnify the effects of these chemicals of concern. And it affects 2 billion people worldwide. So having a diet healthy in iodine can partly stem the problem that we're talking about here today. Not to mention using a wet mop, vacuuming regularly, and limiting dust contamination from other persistent organic fluids. Now, I hear a lot about the cost of these safer alternatives. I work at a public hospital called Bellevue Hospital in New York City that serves low-income populations across New York City as a pediatrician. And when I talk about this, people look at me like I'm weird because they think that these steps are only for the rich or those with substantial resources. But we all can succeed in reducing these exposures, and the economic benefits of preventing these exposures do actually often outweigh the costs. So a lot of people also say to me, well, if I substitute out these chemicals in my product, I won't be able to make a profit. That's just not the reality. The reality is when you push for safer alternatives, you create a market for innovation. And you create opportunities for new companies to come in and make the safer alternatives at much lower costs. So here's an example that really brings this point home. So we did a study looking at a hypothetical scenario. In the United States, we use BPA still in a lot of aluminum cans. And an alternative that is, at least based on what we know, free of health effects is called oleoresin. It costs 2.2 cents on the can. If you replaced it in all the cans in the United States, it would cost roughly $2.2 billion. Now, what if you were able to get BPA out right away? You would reduce levels of BPA enough so that you would reduce childhood obesity substantially and adult cardiovascular disease, based on current knowledge. There are other disease consequences associated with these chemicals that may also be reduced. If you just focus on those two disease outcomes I mentioned at the beginning, the reduction in disease costs would be on the order of $1.7 billion. That's almost the same as the cost of the safer alternative. And that doesn't even consider all the other disease endpoints that have been associated with BPA, like cognitive effects, breast cancer, among other consequences. And when you look at some of the uncertainties in our own estimates of the benefits, there actually are scenarios where the benefits could actually be even on the order of $13 billion a year, almost sixfold the economic costs that we're talking about. So as much as people say that safer alternatives are costly, the economic benefits in the short and long term can actually outweigh the costs. The other piece of the story that people don't talk about is that we have already succeeded in some very substantial ways in reducing endocrine disrupting chemical exposures. In the United States, we got BPA banned in baby bottles and sippy cups in 2008. This is almost a decade ago. And that was not just because of the science. There was science at the time. But what we had at the time was a lot of public awareness. You were hearing about bisphenol A on the Today Show and other media outlets. And that attention made the companies that make these baby bottles and sippy cups, they don't make the chemicals, they make the baby bottles and sippy cups. They went to their providers of the raw materials and said, change your ways. They changed their ways, and the companies then ran to the US Food and Drug Administration and insisted on a ban to reassure the public. So that's an example where consumer action can actually drive the change that we seek as a result of what science tells us is a problem. More recently, there are a group of chemicals called the perfluoroalkyl substances. They're what we call the forever chemicals because they stay in the body for years. They're used in non-stick cooking materials. They're also used in water repellent and oil repellent fabrics. It took just the study of 5 food packages to get 2 major supermarket chains to get the PFAS out of the face-out food packaging. And more recently, a major company, a German-based company that is heavily operating in the northeast of the United States, Ahold Delhaize, has promised to get PFAS out of all of its materials, not just the buffet-style food packaging. That's a very public statement that was not driven by some regulatory agency. And it speaks to the fact that even when the government may not be aligned with the message and the problem and really understand the stakes that are involved, that public movements can support the actions that are needed. So I see a lot of hope. I don't see sadness the way some might think that I do. I'm not generally an optimist either. So this should pass along a reassuring message. And I have reason for that. In that the millennials and the post-millennials have really opened up a conversation about environmentalism that we didn't even think about 5 years ago. And it's largely Greta Thunberg who has led the way in that respect on climate change. And there's something interesting about climate change and endocrine disruption that has a common force behind it. So fossil fuel production drives the raw materials for plastics just as it drives climate change. And the same is true when it comes to fossil fuels, which are the feedstock for many endocrine disrupting chemicals. And so if we address climate change, we actually will address part of the endocrine disrupting chemical problem. But there's something bigger than that that's the point I'm trying to make. And that is that we have an opportunity to have a broader conversation because of the discussion and the concern by the younger generations about climate change. So with no offense to the audience, we need to go out and focus on the youngest generation who might be focused on manga or other activities or what have you, but they care about these issues and they want to hear about what's affecting their health and their lives. They've already been primed for this message, and that's a real opportunity that gives me substantial hope. So with that, arigato for the opportunity to present. I'm privileged to say that much like the legacy of Our Still in Future, we're hopeful that my book on endocrine disrupting chemicals called SickerFatterPoorer will soon be translated into Japanese. The plans are well underway. So I look forward to your comments and questions.
ありがとうございました。またコメントをお聞きしたいと思うんですけれども、
非常に分かりやすい講演ありがとうございました。BPA の代替品ということの中で、BPS という名前が挙がりましたけれども、調べてみると BPS っていうのは東京火星というところが日本では作っているということがインターネットで調べると分かりました。それで BPS というのはどういう点で、BPA と似たような影響を及ぼすのかということをもうちょっと詳しくお話しいただければと思います。
With pleasure. What little we know about BPS is that it is as potent at the estrogen receptor, that is, it is as estrogenic, it is as toxic to embryos, and it's as persistent in the environment. And there's a very recent study that suggests that levels of BPS in the urines of adults can predict the development of diabetes. And this is a human study. So we're already seeing effects of BPS. We've done a study in the Dutch population where we found that BPS can be associated, especially with lower levels of folate in the diet, with increases in the time to pregnancy, that is, delays in fertility and conception. So there are a variety of consequences that are already well documented now for the effects of this regrettable substitute on human health that have broad population level consequences, not just in France or the Netherlands, but even here in Japan and across the world.
有害の化学物質からの人体の影響、あるいは次世代の影響について、生産の視点からの研究をされているでしょうか。生産の違いからの研究はされているでしょうか。
Arigato for the question. Yes, there are a host of consequences that affect specific sexes in a different way. I already alluded to one example with bisphenol A and its risk for obesity. The literature is full of examples where boys may be affected more than girls and vice versa. In addition, there are the consequences of chemicals that can only affect boys. For example, the phthalates, the testosterone inhibitors that I talked about, have been associated with changes in the genitals of young boys that have not been associated with effects on young girls. It's not as if those chemicals don't also have some estrogen effects, but because they chiefly have effects on testosterone, they can produce much more substantial consequences and particular adverse effects that just affect boys.
簡単な質問ですが、環境ホルモンを含めてですね、こういう化学物質とか有害物質を規制するというその政府当局のスタンスとしてはですね、ヨーロッパの国々に比べてアメリカというのは非常に消極的ないしネガティブなスタンスがずっと続いていたというイメージがあるんですけれど、昨今それがですね変わってきたということなのでしょうかというのはちょっと聞きたい。これなぜかというとですね、私がいる日本という国はですね、アメリカの指示をずっと追いかけていて、アメリカがうんとおっしゃらないとですね、規制をしないという傾向が非常に強いので、アメリカの動向が私たちのその政治にとってですね、非常に重要なのでお聞きしたいと思います。
I'm not going to sugarcoat the United States, at least the federal government situation. There are many states, the way our government is designed, that have actually decided to act on their own, which they can do through federalism, which is one of the really unique principles of the US government. So Maine, California, Washington State, and New York State have all taken steps to limit some of these exposures. They vary by what exposure and by what source of exposure they focus on, but they have taken proactive steps. I should also say that as much as I made a big comparison between Europe and the United States and focused on flame retardants, the reason why the difference is not as big between Europe and the United States is that the US back in the 1990s did something really thoughtful. Through the Food Quality Protection Act, they added an additional safety factor for children with respect to pesticides. And that led to the reduction of allowable levels of organophosphate pesticides in food. And compare that to Europe, where those steps were not taken as quickly, and that has led to a big difference that's favorable to the United States. So as much as I have to say the situation in the United States right now is not ideal, at least at the federal level, for action There are examples where the United States has shown substantial leadership in reducing endocrine disrupting chemical exposures. ありがとう。
副大学の補助と申します。興味深いお話ありがとうございました。今セータの質問がありまして、男児が影響を受けやすいっていうことだったんですけれども、年齢というか生理小児科医でいらっしゃるんですけれども、体内暴露は一番影響があるでしょうけど、その生まれてからのその年齢でそういう影響の受け方は男児女児で違うということはございますでしょうか。教えてください。
Thank you for the wonderful question. As a pediatrician, my usual response has been in the past to say that pregnancy and puberty are the most vulnerable windows of susceptibility. But the more I do work in this field, I appreciate that life is a vulnerable window of susceptibility. There are studies now showing that adults suffer substantial health effects of these endocrine disrupting chemical exposures. The perfluoroalkyl substances I talked about have been associated with gain of weight in adults who successfully lost weight through healthy diet and physical activity. And the reason that happened is they found that these chemicals were associated with a reduction in the resting metabolic rate. That's the body's burn rate of energy. And you can imagine today's not as cold as yesterday was, for example, but imagine a cold, rainy day in Tokyo and the thermostat is turned the wrong way. That's what the body is doing in response to the perfluoroalkyl substances. When the body needs to burn energy, the body is simply not burning energy and then keeping the energy as fat. The studies I talked about with the bisphenol A replacement were in adults. So yes, in general, children, pregnant women are the most vulnerable populations. But life is a vulnerable window of susceptibility.
では私の方から一つお伺いしたいんですけれども、今日安全かつ簡単な対策ということでいくつか身近にできることというのをご紹介いただきました。そういった対策を実践した場合にどの程度化学物質への暴露が減るのか、そういうことについての何かデータがあればご紹介いただけますでしょうか。
Thank you for allowing me to elaborate. So, substituting diet to reduce exposure to bisphenol A and phthalates is associated with a 2/3 decrease in levels of those chemicals in the urine. For pesticides, steps to eat organic have reduced pesticides to the non-detectable range. That is below the lowest level that they can find in children. Changing the cosmetics and personal care products that young girls use has reduced phthalates and benzophenone by on the order of 50%. So these are not small changes, and they occur in 1 to 3 days' time. That speaks to how quickly you can change your exposure. And I'd like to say there are short, medium, and long-term benefits to these changes. So just to stick to the phthalate example, phthalates also irritate the sinuses. You may have noticed I have a bit of a runny nose, so that may be why it's on my mind. Let's say if I stopped using a phthalate cosmetic, I might have reduction in the sinus symptoms in a day or two. I might have changes in my hormonal levels in a couple of weeks. In a few months, I may see changes in my chronic disease profile of risk. So there are these short, medium, and long-term benefits of these safe and simple steps.
他にどなたか質問がありますでしょうか。
日本の小児科や産婦人科のお医者さんがこういうことについて患者さんとか皆さんにお話をしてくださると大変ありがたいんですけども、先生がアメリカの学会とか国際学会でこういうことを問題になさっている時に日本のお医者さんが国際学会へ参加されてどんな反応がお持ちなのかっていうのがぜひ知りたいんですけれども、教えていただけたらありがたいと思います。
Arigato for the question. Thank you. I have generally found a very positive response, but I think the positive response is biased by the population that attends those meetings. In many ways, those are the most aware scientists with respect to the medical literature internationally. I can recall coming to the Japan Endocrine Society to give a presentation, and fortunately I didn't have the privilege of the translators, and it was a much more modestly attended presentation. My sense is that when you speak about the science and talk doctor to doctor, scientist to scientist, or what have you, there are questions, but there's not resistance. The only difficulty is, of course, the fact that the average doctor gets maybe 1 or 2 or 3 hours of environmental health training, even in the United States. And that's usually lead and air pollution. Endocrine disrupting chemicals don't make the list because I can't prescribe a treatment for endocrine disruption. That doesn't exist. The treatment is prevention. That is a barrier to this issue, but that doesn't limit the scientific basis and the benefits for providing these safe and simple steps to reduce the exposures of greatest concern. So I'm very hopeful. To me, the issue is as much getting to the right audiences that touch the patients and really care for families that are unfortunately seeing these chronic seeing these conditions firsthand.
今お医者さんの話が出たので伺いたいと思ったんですけど、医療機器、チューブとかですね、ああいうものがすごくなんか私から見ると危険な感じがするんですが、そういうものに対しての改善とかはなされているのでしょうか。
That's a very valid concern. I don't want to steal too much of Dr. Myers' story in this respect. I think he's about to reflect on this quite a bit. But it's fair to say that these devices are often used in the sicker patients who are smaller. If you think about the newborn I presented at the beginning of the presentation, we have newborn intensive care units now that use a lot of these medical devices, and this is as even Paracelsus might have a problem with these kinds of exposures. There are studies underway to understand the consequences. The good news is there is substantial awareness in the medical device industry that is pushing some leaders to change the use and eliminate, for example, phthalates from the NICU and other settings. I'm not saying it's happened completely, but there has been progress compared to some of the exposures I described here.
Yeah. もう一つ私からよろしいでしょうか。先ほど、アメリカの規制について連邦レベルでは全く期待ができないというお話があったんですけれども、州レベルでは期待ができるような取り組みもあるというふうにお伺いしたんですが、もしよろしければそういったものをご紹介いただけますでしょうか。
So, Washington State, for example, I would argue made the biggest step forward. Usually we talk about California as the first. in the United States, but when it comes to food packaging in particular, Washington State took the biggest step very recently on phthalates, the perfluoroalkyl substances, essentially requiring the use of safer alternatives. The issue that we have with some of these steps is that we have to be sure the safer alternatives are not unsafe. And there often are not enough data to support that with enough certainty. In general, a solution that I appreciate with Washington State is also their approach to treating chemicals like classes. We've already talked about BPS, BPF, BPP, BPZ, etc. If you simply ban bisphenols, you can't use BPS, BPP, BPZ, etc. That would be a principle that is enshrined in the Washington legislation and is something that can be used more generally with great effect, and is grounded in substantial evidence that the replacements that are in the same class have the same effects. Sometimes they're metabolized into the older version of the chemical.
ありがとうございました。すみません。ではそろそろ時間となりましたので、一旦こちらで休憩に入りますが、また後ほど最後にまとめて Q&A セッションを設けますので、もし聞き足りないことがあったらその時にお尋ねください。ではトラサンデ先生に盛大な拍手をジョン・ピーターソン・マイヤーズ先生をお迎えしたいと思います。マイヤーズ先生、壇上の方にお越しいただけますでしょうか。では簡単にマイヤーズ先生について私の方からご紹介させていただきます。マイヤーズ先生は1996年に日本で発行されて、日本で環境ホルモン問題に注目が集まり、私たち国民会議が設立されたきっかけとなった本である奪われし未来の執筆者のお一人です。国民会議とも深い関わりがあって、私もマイヤーズ先生に知り合っていなかったらきっと化学物質の問題に取り組むことはなかったというふうに思っています。前回は2008年国民会議の10周年の際にお越しいただきましたので、今回は11年ぶりに来日していただくことができました。本日は環境ホルモン問題の問題が決して終わっていない、そして世界ではものすごく重要な問題になっているなということをお話しいただきたいと思います。ではマイヤーズ先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Dr. Trasande's Japanese is much better than mine. Dr. Trasande and I share many common views of this issue, and you will note some similarities between what I say and what he has said. And we haven't coordinated our talks, but the fact I will be repeating some of the key points that he made should tell you something about the strength of the science that now underpins endocrine disruption. So I was very distressed to learn that endocrine disruption work has gone backwards in Japan, with some key exceptions we'll be hearing from one of the luminaries following me. But the amazing start that Japan undertook at the beginning of the studies of endocrine disruption led the world. And so I thought Japanese science was going to continue to lead the world, and Japanese policy would continue to lead the world. And in 2008, it didn't look bad. But as I've learned on this visit, things have gotten much worse. The fact of the matter is the science since 2008 has gotten much stronger globally. And I think it's somewhat tragic that the Japanese people have been left behind for almost a generation now. And I hope that our comments today can, in their protection from endocrine disrupting compounds, I hope that our comments today provide some motivation to get moving again. Because we need you, the world needs you in solving these problems with the scientific skills that you bring to the picture. I'm going to start with a personal story. This is my granddaughter. She was born in January 2019, 2 months premature, weighing 1 kilo. She then spent 2 months in the neonatal intensive care unit in Uplan, California, where my daughter lives. And when my granddaughter grows up and is told about the miracles that the plastics in the neonatal intensive care unit helped her accomplish, the miracle of surviving from being 1 kilo at birth, she'll probably say, thank you, plastics, because it saved her life. But unfortunately, there's another side to this, which I think you heard about somewhat from Leo, but it's even more direct. Some of you know that in Paradise, California, in November 2018, there was a horrific fire. 88 dead, hundreds of homes incinerated. There you see some of them. Hundreds of homes full of plastic, because it's such a common building material today. And the uppermost part of that plume there, the whitest, that's where Paradise is. And the smoke came almost as if it was in a hose, straight to Uplan, where my daughter was in her first few weeks of her third trimester. 2 months later, we learned that she had gone into intensive care because of preeclampsia. And she had to have a cesarean, so the baby's birth was forced 2 months premature. This was pretty much the worst air pollution that San Francisco had ever experienced. And because of the nature of what burned in that fire, I can guarantee you there were many plastic fumes present there also. So as a scientist and a grandfather, I quickly began to search the literature. What are known risk factors for preeclampsia? What caused the premature birth? And it was within 15 minutes that I found a series of papers linking as a risk factor preeclampsia to various plastic components and to intense air pollution, smoke. Now, as a scientist, I know that doesn't prove anything. What it does is it raises a plausible link between what my daughter and granddaughter went through and the presence of plastics in those fumes. And what I want to do is, this is the first slide. What I want to ask is the following. How do we get here where miraculous materials like plastics that can do so many amazing things, and which we have brought into our homes, assuming they are safe, how did we wind up in the situation where miracle and risk are part of the same picture? And how can we get out of it? What can we do to solve that problem? We bring plastics in our homes in many different ways. We wrap our food in it. Food packaging material is one of the biggest sources that we know of plastic contamination in food. We line our pots and pans with Teflon-related chemicals that are basically a plastic, and Dr. Shirsade mentioned them, the perfluorinated compounds. We fill our furniture, our computers, he mentioned flame retardants. We bring those into our home. The chemicals go into the dust on the ground in our homes, and babies and cats crawl around in it and pick it up and put it in their mouths. We have plastic water bottles that are made of various types of plastics. We line our cans with bisphenol A, less so here in Japan, but it's still a very common practice in the US. And we have thermal paper, which is probably in the US the biggest source of exposure to bisphenol A because it's on the surface of those paper in dust at high levels. And every time you pick one up and handle it, your skin absorbs the bisphenol A. I was part of this world that thought plastics were just fine. As a graduate student, I would go into the shop at my laboratory and cut polycarbonate plastic with a table saw. I didn't know that the smell that was coming off of that plastic, the heated plastic, was bisphenol A. I gave my daughter, when she was 3, a rubber ducky. I didn't know at the time rubber duckies in the 1980s were 40+% by weight phthalates. That's what makes a polyvinyl chloride polymer, which normally would be rigid, into a wonderfully squeezable rubber ducky. And I didn't know about the lining of cans by bisphenol A. So my favorite winter drink was to open a can, pour it into a pot, heat it up, and drink chicken broth laced with bisphenol A all winter long. When I started to learn about this in the early 1990s, we got every can out of our house, and there hasn't been one there since. Oh, so here are the questions that I laid out. Well, how did we get into this predicament? Why do we let EDC chemicals become so common? And is there a path forward? I think the answer to the last one is yes, there is a path forward. And I'm not going to skip over some unpleasant stuff to get you there, but I'm going to end with what I think are some important directions that we can head. The plastics industry tried to convince us for years of how good this stuff is. This is an ad they ran in National Geographic, America's Magazine. Plastics, an important part of your healthy diet. The 6th major food group of your diet. The Americas were saturated with ads like this beginning in the 1950s. How many of you watched The Graduate with Dustin Hoffman, the movie, in 1969? There was a famous line in that movie where the older man looked at Dustin Hoffman, who was wondering, what can I do with my future? And he said, plastics. And that guy was really smart, at least if you're interested in the economic return of your life course, because plastics then became a very big deal. What we didn't know, and here is the key to how did we let this happen, we didn't know until the 1960s and 70s that hormones are key to altering gene expression, key to making genes turn on and turn off at key parts of life, especially in the fetus. We just didn't, the basic stuff hadn't been done yet. It began to be published in the 60s and the 70s. What we didn't know at the time was that certain chemicals can hack that signaling system, can hack hormone signaling. That's what we learned beginning in the 1970s. Dr. Trasande gave some examples. We're friends, so I'll call him Leo. Is that okay? Yeah. We didn't know that EDC chemicals were there, and they were interfering with hormonal expression. They were interfering with how genes are turned on and off as the fetus develops into a fully functional adult. We didn't know of the profound consequences those exposures, that hormone hacking, can cause. We were in the medical wilderness. In the late 1980s, when Theo Colborn and I really began to dig into endocrine disruption, we were in the medical wilderness when we wrote Our Stolen Future in 1996. Most people sort of laughed at it if they knew about it at all, although I thank Japan. It was a bestseller in Japan. I can go on to some of the wonderful things that happened to me here in the late 1990s as I met JEPA, and membership and helped them think about what could be done. So back then, we were in the wilderness. But as Leo mentioned, the Endocrine Society, which is the world's professional association of endocrinologists, a mixture of 70% physicians who are treating people with endocrine-related disorders, who are seeing an epidemic arise of different types of chronic diseases that are driven by failures in the endocrine system to work properly. That's what their patients see. That's what their patients bring to them. So 70% are physicians, 30% are research scientists, and those research scientists, seeing what they were seeing both in animal research and epidemiology, began to talk to the physicians. In fact, it was the physicians who went to them and asked them, what's happening? Why are we seeing such extraordinary increases in type 2 diabetes, in obesity, in prostate cancer, in breast cancer, in autism, in ADHD? Why is this happening? And the scientists began to explore potential answers. And fortunately, a lot of money, including from Japan and the US and Europe, began to flow into people asking those questions. So since the time that we were in the medical wilderness, literally hundreds of millions of dollars have been applied to research to answer those questions. Tens of thousands of scientists have published tens of thousands of articles providing insight into what's been happening. The Endocrine Society was followed, as Leo mentioned, by a statement from the World Health Organization concluding that endocrine disruption is a global public health threat. He and I didn't make that up. It's real. That came out in 2012. Here is a diagram, a word cloud, of some of the conditions that endocrine failures related to chronic diseases for which science now offers some evidence, not perfect evidence, because science never reaches perfection. There's always uncertainty. But for each of these disease states up here, there's strong evidence saying that endocrine disrupting compounds are contributing. Is it 2%? Is it 20%? Is it 50%? It certainly varies across those different conditions. But any percentage gives us an opportunity to prevent that, some portion of that condition. One of the biggest findings that's come out of this field over the last 30 years is sperm count decline, which Leo mentioned. That stuff that began to appear in the early 1990s, some famous papers by a group of Danish scientists. It was challenged when it first came out by people with good intentions, scientists who always challenge new results, and also by some people who actually didn't want us to learn about the consequences of endocrine disrupting compounds. But in 2017, Dr. Shauna Swan and her colleagues published the definitive paper on this that Leo mentioned. A 50% decline in human sperm count over 5 decades in Western countries. 50% decline. And they looked at how the curve had changed over time. Oh, faster declines are happening now in China, although we didn't have the data to do a 5-decade study. But here are two graphs, both the raw data and a multiple regression analysis. It's a 60% decline from 1972 to 2012, more or less, in Western countries. Lower declines in some of the other regions. And at the time when this study was completed, there were insufficient data from the developing world to reach any strong conclusions. So that's one example, and I can go on at length about the strong links between changes in sperm count and exposure to specifically phthalates, but also a host of other endocrine disrupting compounds, particularly those that interfere with testosterone, and there, as Leo mentioned, there are a number of them, including the perfluorinating compounds. So I could go on with detailed descriptions of 10,000 papers, but I don't even think JEPA wants me to do that. Instead, what I'd like to do is ask about some general findings in this scientific literature that have emerged clearly over the last 20 years. One of them, exposure to EDCs is ubiquitous. And I'll come back, I'll list them and then go back to them one by one. Exposure is ubiquitous. Low doses matter a lot. What starts in the womb does not end in the womb. It can play out over the lifetime of an individual exposed in the womb and beyond. And the testing methods that have been used by regulatory agencies, unfortunately, are deeply flawed. We really, based on their approaches, we do not know what is safe and what is not. It's that simple. And I hope by the end of this I'll have convinced you that. Leo explored it to some degree also. So, exposure is ubiquitous. This was a paper in 1995 that gave us some picture as to how ubiquitous it was. They sampled 95 pieces of tree bark from something like 40 countries around the world, including the jungles in New Guinea, and they found persistent organic pollutants, including endocrine disrupting compounds, in every sample they studied. So I hope I convinced you earlier with those few slides, and also Leo's comments, that we already are exposed in the home. Already. The exposure is not just in the home, it's global. Polar bears are the end of an amazing system of air currents that takes persistent organic pollutants, semi-volatile compounds like many of the endocrine disruptors, takes them from where they are produced and used, because they're semi-volatile, they evaporate, they go into the clouds, it gets cold, they come down again, and gradually it works. It carries those molecules all the way to the poles. And so today, there are endocrine disrupting compounds in that polar bear, who's at the top of the food chain in the Arctic. Not just the Arctic, but in alpine areas, glaciers. And there's another one, beyond what Leo mentioned about the ties between global warming and endocrine disruption. Global warming is reliberating, is letting go, allowing chemicals like that to re-escape into the ecosystem. And there's some strong studies confirming that that's happening today. And then this is one last example. A group of French scientists a couple of years ago published a study of the skin of ants, ant cuticles. They sampled ants from 70 countries on 3 continents, and they found phthalates in every ant they measured at levels sufficient to interfere with the ant's reproduction and immune system function. They even found that the ants in the Amazon forest, far away from places where phthalates are used, carried significant levels of phthalates. So back to that slide, exposure is ubiquitous, low doses matter a lot. Let's go to the low doses matter a lot. As I was getting into this science, I really had to ask myself, what is a low dose? Are low doses really low? And I began to approach it by asking, what's a part per billion? You hear that amount often in endocrine disruption research because endocrine disrupting compounds work at parts per billion. So here's one way to think about 1 part per billion. It's 1 pancake in a stack of pancake 4,000 miles high. Sounds like a small amount, right? But let's turn that around and let's ask, if you have a drop of water that in it has 1 part per billion of bisphenol A, 1 drop of water, 1 part per billion bisphenol A, how many molecules of BPA do you think are in that drop? I know there's some chemists here who could probably work their way towards the answer, but I'll let them know. 2.65 trillion molecules of BPA are in that 1 drop of water. And when you have physiological and endocrinological processes that are affected by small numbers of molecules, that's a lot of harm that 1 part per billion can cause. The chemist, Avogadro's number, leads you inexorably to that calculation. So, Leo refers to the perfluorinated compounds. That's become a big issue in the US because we're finding that contamination is so pervasive. And a whole series of studies that have come out over the last few years, including quite recently, are telling us that our initial estimates as to what was safe and what was not have been way off, way off. In fact, the head of the, based on both epidemiological studies like the Italian study mentioned there, looking at how perfluorinated compounds affect reproductive characteristics of young men, including sperm count decline, loss of libido, shorter penises. The head of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences just this past year said, we've got to reduce our estimated safe dose of perfluorinated compounds by a factor of 70 to 0.1 parts per trillion. That's a low amount. So, and as Leo said, these things are incredibly persistent and the exposure to them is very, very widespread. Is artificial turf used commonly here in Japan on sports fields? Turns out the blades of grass in that artificial turf come out more readily if the extruder that's used to make them has been injected with perfluorinated compounds. So every artificial turf in the US installation has perfluorinated compounds, and they leach out of the turf as it's being disposed. So here's the third one. Events in the womb don't stay in the womb. The inside of a mouse, my age in mouse years. So getting up there. This is the control mouse. This is work by Dr. Fred Bumsall, who has come to Japan many times. Its kidneys are normal. Its bladder is normal. It's a male. What would have happened to that control animal in my age in mouse years? What would have happened if it had been exposed to 20 parts per billion of bisphenol A in the womb? So mom mouse had been given drinking water with 20 parts per billion bisphenol A in it. What would have happened? Its kidneys have gone completely necrotic. Its bladder, had this animal not been sacrificed, would have exploded within a few days. It's a male. What happened? The urethra connects the bladder to the outside world. It's what mice and men and women pee through. There's a piece of the urethra as it passes through the prostate gland with tissue that is especially sensitive to bisphenol A. It altered the epigenetic expression of genes in that tissue. It changed their response to future hormonal stimulation. so that as the animal aged, its urethra gradually constricted until it could no longer pee. Now, if you are an advanced molecular geneticist, you could detect that effect at birth with the right tools. But this is not visible until well into towards the end of the life of that animal. So traditional toxicological tests rarely work on that. I'll get to that point momentarily. But the effects extend beyond the first generation. How many of you have heard of what's called transgenerational epigenetic inheritance? This is a field that began to emerge in endocrine disruption in 2005 with a series of publications. It now has been replicated, extended to many different endocrine disrupting compounds and many different health endpoints. And bottom line, what happens is, so this is a family with great-grandmother, grandmother, mother, daughter, right? What we now know is that certain exposures to great-grandmother, which end with great-grandmother, can affect gene expression that are carried to the granddaughter. Transgenerational epigenetic inheritance with no changes in DNA sequence. It's the epigenetic control of gene expression is inherited faithfully, even though there's no change in DNA sequence. This is now well established as a phenomenon. No one's sure exactly what the mechanism is, although there are many theories, and I can provide you with the literature. But this is an amazingly important public health finding, that great-grandmother's exposure can be manifest in great-granddaughter. One of the most recent papers is here. This is looking at a mouse model of autism, in which great-grandmother's exposure to bisphenol A leads to autistic-like behaviors in the grandmother, the mother, and the grandmother, and the granddaughter, and the grandson. And this study is interesting because not only did they find the transgenerational epigenetic inheritance of autism, they also found that genes that are known in people to be associated with autism are altered in this experiment. Not proof, but moving toward it. And then this study was published in March, and it complicated life still farther. This is with glyphosate, the component of Roundup. And what they found was that they exposed great-grandmother and then looked at effects on sperm parameters of males in subsequent generations. And they didn't see anything in the son, in great-grandmother's sons. Nothing. They only began to see them in the grandsons and the great-grandsons. So it's called generation jumping. If this isn't a reason to take precautionary measures to address endocrine disrupting compounds in public policy, I don't know what is. This is really important. And lastly, in this line of presentation, if you think about the experimental model where they expose great-grandmother, then there's no subsequent direct exposure through the next generations. It's a little more complicated in the male and mammal, but Patricia Hunt at Washington State University said that's not what happens in our lives. We're exposed, great-grandmother's exposed, grandmother's exposed, mother is exposed, granddaughter is exposed. And so she said, I'm going to do an experiment where I expose them at each generation. And she found that the effects were compounded. The consequences built over time compared to just that single exposure. It got worse. In fact, it got so bad that by the third generation, there were many males in the experiment who did not reproduce. This last major finding is that the testing methods that we depend upon to find out what's safe and what's not are deeply flawed. And this has been a really painful realization for me as I've been in this field for several decades. Most chemicals have not even been tested for endocrine disrupting compounds. The tests that are used are flawed and terribly outdated. There's one called the eutotrophic assay, which tried to use to establish the basic estrogenicity of a compound. It was invented in 1935. We can do a lot better than that with modern molecular biology, but the agencies have not adapted to those new techniques. There are some core assumptions that are just completely wrong. And then, unfortunately, because of the amount of money that's at stake, there are people whose livelihoods depend upon confusing the regulators, confusing the governments, to make sure that the regulations that would protect us are not changed, so the chemicals are still protected. I want to focus, actually I'll skip that. I want to focus on two of the flawed assumptions. The first one you heard a little bit about from Leo. It's called the Paracelsus problem. And the second one is called the cocktail effect. There's that same photo of Paracelsus that Leo showed you, the guy who lived in the 16th century and discovered that the dose appears to be the most important aspect of toxicity. Let me show you how flawed that is. Those are two mice in an experiment carried out by Retha Newbold et al. At the National Academy of Sciences in the US. It's the same strain of mouse. Their caloric intake and activities levels were monitored throughout the lifetime of the individuals into adulthood. They were statistically not distinguishable. But one of them clearly is morbidly obese. That's the experimental animal. The other is the control animal. That morbidly obese animal was exposed to 1 part per billion of a powerful endocrine disrupting chemical. And we know enough about the mechanisms now. Leo's told you about some of them. We can ask more about it in the question and answer period. But my point here is not just this effect, but what would happen if instead of 1 part per billion, the experimental mouse have been exposed to 1,000 parts per billion? Would it explode? That's what common sense might suggest would happen. But actually, that mouse is skinnier than the control animal. It loses weight compared to the control animal. And here's where the dose makes the poison fails. Because regulatory tests would have begun at high doses, seen the weight loss, and concluded that that's the main effect of that chemical. They then would have worked down the dose response curve until they saw no effect. They never would see the morbid obesity in their tests. Never. Here's another example, a bit more quantitative, that makes the same case. This is actually a graph done by Wade Welshans at the University of Missouri. It's about tamoxifen, which is a drug used to treat breast cancer. And you can see in the graph why tamoxifen is useful, because if that's the control, here this graph is the growth of a breast tumor in cell preparation. The control is there. At high parts per thousand, tamoxifen reduces the size of the tumor, as indicated by the red asteroids, which shows where there's statistically significant results. So a toxicological test of tamoxifen's effect and toxicity would work down the dose response curve. The next dose also is statistically significant, but then you see a range of doses where there appears to be no effect. And the toxicologists in their standard operating procedure for 100 years would say, okay, that's the no observed adverse effect level. It's the level, the highest level at which there was no effect. And then they would use a series of estimation factors to basically say, well, a mouse is not a little person and a baby isn't a little adult. And for each of those, they would have a 10-fold reduction. Adults are not, and there's differences among people, and you would reach a level that they call the safe level, the reference dose, and that's it. They never test at the lower doses beneath the one at which they find no effect. So Dr. Welshans said, okay, I'm going to see what the effects are beneath the low level, the NOEL, and what he found is shown here. The biggest effect is seen at exactly the dose that the FDA would consider tamoxifen to be safe, because that's where maximum growth of the tumor is caused by this endocrine disrupting compound. Doctors know about this. It's called a tamoxifen flare. It hurts. When doctors are prescribing tamoxifen to women, they try and get it beyond that level, up above into the doses where tamoxifen is actually working. If they slip back down into that range, it hurts. At exactly the level that the FDA would consider tamoxifen safe. So if you establish the true NOEL, and then the safe dose of tamoxifen based on this consideration is very, very, very close to zero. That's how all toxicology testing is done to establish regulatory safety. So let me give you one last example here. There's a famous experiment by the US FDA that's just being published on BPA, trying to figure out why academic studies find BPA is not safe and the FDA finds levels that are safe. And I want you to think carefully about this way that what happens at low doses is different from what happens at high doses. Okay? The FDA assumes that cannot happen. If they see data where there are low dose effects and no high dose effects, they say the low dose effects are not biologically plausible. They reject them. Yet here's the FDA's own data showing statistically significant results at extremely low doses, while there are no effects, similar effects at high doses. So the FDA says, I'm sorry, we're going to ignore these low dose effects. If you approach this as an endocrinologist, you say, no, the low dose effects are real. And then so let's use the low dose effects to estimate what the real safe level of exposure to bisphenol A should be. Well, it's there, and it's 20,000 times lower than the FDA's current safe dose estimate. 20,000 times lower. This pattern of exposure of low dose effects are not predictable by high dose experiments is the rule for hormones. It's what you learn in your first year's class of endocrinology. It's how hormones behave. It's no surprise that chemicals that behave like hormones show the same effects. And yet it violates the core assumptions of how safety is established by every governmental agency in the world. The second of these effects is called the cocktail effect. Some of you may have seen House, the TV program. I just used him as a symbol of the doctor. I could use a picture of Leo also as a symbol of the doctor. What's the first thing that your physician asks you when they prescribe new medicine? First thing, what other drugs are you taking? Because mixtures matter. Pharmaceuticals enhance toxic effects and good effects. Chemicals are chemicals. It's an artificial line between pharmaceuticals and toxic chemicals. Toxic chemicals interact with one another also. And yet regulatory agencies never consider the consequences of mixtures, even though we're all full of hundreds of chemicals. So this is the other second really big weakness in how the document how the regulatory agencies have failed us. I'm not going to show. I can return to this if you want to see it, because I've got to wrap up, and I have to tell you something positive. It was a dark and stormy night in Camden, New Jersey, which is a place near where I grew up, and I knew that in this city, I knew the city was the home of the mobsters. I knew that mobsters, when they don't like what you say, they put your feet in buckets full of wet cement and throw you into the river. So here I am, dark and stormy night, in Camden, New Jersey, addressing the Society of Plastics Engineers. Not my friends, because I've been criticizing plastic and the consequences of the products these engineers make for a long time, including in our book. So I lectured. It was a very confrontational lecture. It was over, and everyone left the room, except for two big guys in the back. And they start to walk toward me. And they come up to me really up close, and they say, Dr. Myers, we like what you're doing. And I go, what? You like what I'm doing? And they say, yeah. You're making certain commodities plastics unsellable in the market. And we've got the replacement. We're going to make a lot of money. Thank you. I had never thought of it that way. I had always been about saying, no, you can't use that chemical. I had never thought about helping chemists design safer materials. But the science that we have learned in endocrine disruption over the last 30 years has given us a lot of insights into the molecular characteristics of endocrine disrupting compounds that we can use as design parameters for new materials. So I set out on a course to work with chemists. The two guys on the outside are famous green chemists. The guy in the middle was a famous endocrine disruption scientist. We trained them to work together. Here they are learning how to cook gourmet appetizers. They're from different fields. You have to do something to facilitate the interactions among them. That's one of the things we did. And we worked for 8 years and produced an intellectual framework. Here's the whole team, about 30 people. We produced an intellectual framework that chemists can use to make money. Because now we know there's a big market for inherently safer materials. Materials that do not disrupt the hormone system. We published it in the biggest journal in the field of green chemistry, published by the Royal Society of Chemistry. And now there are companies, not as many as I would like, but there are companies looking at this system to ask, can we help our chemists help us make more money? Because we know that consumers want safer materials. So, I think we are moving into a new era, where I hope Japan can join us. Use the science. Use the science to redesign chemicals so they're inherently safer, so we know that the replacement isn't one of the regrettable substitutes that Leo referred to, but one where we know it's not an endocrine disrupting compound. We can do that, not perfectly, but so much better than the way virtually every chemical on the market today was designed. So, redesign. Reform. We've got to reform the regulatory process. We've got to help them use modern science instead of depending upon a 16th century principle, which is ridiculous in this world where governments around the world, including Japan, have invested lots and lots of money, billions of dollars, into understanding how molecular genetics works, because that's the level at which you have to be asking these questions. And thirdly, we've got to help people understand this, the public. We've got to recharge the Japanese public with concerns about this, because that interest from them in these issues is going to increase the economic drivers that reward the chemists for designing safer materials. Does that make sense? So there's my granddaughter today. We think she's headed on the right course. You know, I know enough about how events in the womb don't end in the womb, so you know we've got to watch her pretty carefully. But right now things are good. We have some real opportunities to change the course on which we have been headed for 30 years. We have amazing new science. We have the attention of consumers in countries around the world. We even in Europe. Can you imagine this? In Europe in May, when the European Parliament dissolved, they went off to run their elections. The last thing they voted on was a recommendation to the European Council that they use the science of the endocrine society to approach endocrine disrupting compounds. And it passed 447 to 14. Overwhelming support in the European Parliament for doing things right. And I hope that we live in the US to a day in which our federal government will do something like that, and the state governments will move even more strongly than they are now, and that the Japanese government will use this science in the way it should be used. Thank you.
私、本当に久しぶりにマイヤーズ先生にお会いしたんですけれども、すっかりなんか孫バカになっていて、大きい子だなと思っております。それでは、会場質問を。
Not great, just straight up.
はい、会場質問をお受けしたいと思います。
ありがとうございます。私も先生に何年か前にコルボン博士といらした時にいろいろ講演会に行かせていただきました。それで今日の副影響のところに関してちょっと教えていただきたい複合影響で、非常に複合影響というのは難しいと思うんですね。いろんな濃度などでそういうのが難しいので、かく乱作用に関してはどのくらいの複合影響が危険な釣り方なっていうのがっていうことを一つお聞きしたいのと、それから私実は環境過敏症ってenvironmental hypersensitivity, for example, multiple chemical sensitivity or thick building syndrome, you know, and environmental electro hypersensitivity, magnetic hypersensitivity の金属ドタンで、すいません、それで日本語でそういう研究をしておりまして、その先生の化学物質の他の複合影響要因として、私はいろいろ今便利で生活のあれで私たちスマホ、携帯電話なんか大変使っています。それはインドのムンバイの研究で、男の方がここに携帯電話を入れている使用時間によって精子の数とか運動数が違うという論文がだいぶ前に出ました。ところがその後携帯電話を使わないコントロールがいなくなったので、その研究はストップしているんですけれども、先生はその携帯電話のあれというその精子の減少の問題の研究でそういうこともありまして、質問内容としてはそういう化学物質以外のいろんな複合影響、生物的なもの、物理的なものも全ての複合影響をどういうふうにお考えになるかをちょっと教えていただければと思います。
Thank you for that question. It's an astoundingly important question. First, to your question, who's putting money into this sort of research? Where is this research being done? Europe is leading on studies of mixture effects. They've recently committed, I think, about $50 million into a multi-year program with several different universities participating in studying how can we use our current understanding of mixtures to inform regulation, and what do we need to know to improve that. So Europe very definitely is in the forefront. There's other research being done elsewhere, but nothing compared to the European efforts. With respect to cell phone radiation, I think that's a serious problem. And it's understudied. I was just at a conference in Beijing 3 weeks ago, which was attended by Deborah Davis, who's one of the world leading authorities on cell phone radiation. And she made a compelling presentation that it's probably contributing also. But one of the fascinating things about the issue of endocrine disruption and related interferences, for example, cell phones. Cell phone, people often dismiss cell phone radiation as being immaterial because it's not strong enough. And they think that for cell phone radiation to cause an effect, it has to mutate the DNA. It has to break bonds. But endocrine disruption doesn't break bonds in most cases. It interferes with how the receptor and the ligand interact, and that's controlled by very small electrostatic forces, van der Waals forces, etc., and by the shapes of the molecules that are involved there. And the radiations that cell phone mixtures emit, cell phones emit, is well within the range that can affect the binding, the non-covalent binding of hormone receptors and hormone ligands. And so what we're seeing is that multiple forces, not just endocrine disruption, not just cell phones, but diet, exercise, experience, all are affecting gene expression, and often through the same pathways. And so ultimately, we aren't going to be able to look at just mixtures of chemicals. We're going to have to figure out how all these different pathways interact, sometimes positively and sometimes negatively. So it's a really wonderful question. It's one that's going to take researchers decades to solve. But maybe if Japan starts today, you can win a Nobel Prize finding the answer.
それで特に脳神経系への影響を私も75歳の4人の孫を持つ女性研究者なんですけど、子どもの脳神経系への影響をその電磁波では、特に電磁波、スマホでもなくても距離の事情に反比例なので、近くでこう使うことで脳神経系に影響を及ぼすことがいろんな影響をなっているのではないかという、仮説というか、そんなものを持っているものですから、ぜひそういう化学物質の内分泌かく乱物質と一緒にそういういろんな生活環境上の便利なものの、裏側の健康問題で子どもへの特に行動障害、過労とか自閉症スペクトラム症候群とかそういうものにそういうのが効いてくると、それこそ大変な問題になるんではないかというふうに、本当に老婆心、75歳のおばあちゃんとしては老婆心ながらので、どうぞいろいろ教えていただければと思います。
So I am not an expert in the cell phone microwave radiation issue. I would refer to other scientists who are. I would observe the following. When you look at some of the developmental disorders like autism and ADHD, they are increasing so rapidly. I don't know about Japan, but I know in the US, the rate of increase of autism is exponential. And if you simply plot the curve to the future, which may not be scientific, but let's take the data we have and ask where is it headed, 1 in 2 children born in the U.S. by 2044 will be autistic. That's not good. Okay.
今ご質問をいただいて、この稲妻の1個前のスライドについてもう一度説明をしていただきたいということでしたので、そちらを今説明をお願いしたところです。
This is an experiment that addresses the issue of mixtures. It's one of the early experiments, but it's even then, in 2002, the results were compelling, that mixtures cannot be ignored. In this experiment, it was set up, so looking at a measure of estrogenicity, and this is the result of exposure to estradiol, estrogen. It doesn't matter exactly what the units are for the basic point. These are estrogenic pesticides whose doses have been adjusted so that there's no statistically significant difference between no exposure to that pesticide and exposure to that pesticide at that dose. Okay? And then, so those are the individual pesticides. And then in the experiment, in the experiment, this is from Andreas Kortenkamp's lab, and these results have been extended significantly since then. So estradiol alone, 11-week estrogens, all adjusted to not have a significant effect. What happens when you mix them? If you just add up the effects, this effect plus, 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 this is the predicted impact of the combination of those. But if you actually do the measurement, the estrogenicity of this complex mixture is twice the effect of estradiol alone. Does that make sense? And there have been many experiments now that basically say 1 plus 1 is not equal to 2.
最後のところなんですけれども、最後に対策したより内分泌かく乱の信頼化学物質というか、その製品を作るような動きが出てきたという話をされていたのだと思うんですけれども、振り返って日本の環境ホルモンが騒ぎになった頃に、缶詰に関しては缶詰業界がかなり画期的なことを言って、ビスフェノール A が溶出しないような形に製品を変えて、業界自主基準で国の基準がないんですけども、かなり低いレベルでの基準を作ったことがあったんですね。ただ日本でこの環境ホルモンを皆さん忘れてしまったんで、そういう努力を缶詰業界はしたんだけれども、あまり現在は評価されていない悲しい状態があるんですけれども、質問したいのは一点、要は、ある化学物質が使われる、ビスフェノール A でもいいんですけど、それをやめて別のものに変えるって場合にですね、その別のものの安全性っていうのをやっぱり同じぐらいきちんと調べないと、本当に安全になったのかどうかっていうのはわからないと思うんですけれども、そういうこのものがどう評価されて、これ代替品の何でしょうね、すいません、具体的な例で、何か対策をした商品みたいなのっていうのがもう出てきているのでしょうか。それを教えてもらえればありがたいんですが。
I apologize that something happened in the transmission of the translations, but I did catch the last part of that question. And yes, there are examples. The best example for a specific replacement for BPA that has been developed using these procedures involving some of the scientists in this list is now on the market thanks to a company called Valspar, which is part of Sherwin-Williams, which is a big international company based in the U.S. And the key to this proposal is you must test. You can't assume safety. You must test. And we proposed a sequence of tests that you could take that were cheap at first, so you could throw out the obvious bad stuff right away, and they got more and more expensive to test it, the more results you got that indicated it's safe by being careful about your test. And that's what Valspar has done. They worked with these scientists, and they were able to show that a particular chemical, whose name I forget right now, which is actually a variant of BPA, but it's a much more complicated polymer, that it's bound so tightly together that despite multiple challenges, it does not cause the types of estrogenic effects that BPA causes. So this is, and right now, it's in 100 million cans around the world. It's already commercial. I don't know if Valspar is getting credit from the moms of the world for having taken this step, but they're certainly getting credit from this collection of scientists who are thrilled that a product that emerged from their thinking is now in 100 million cans.
この缶詰表示はされていくんですか？
I can't.
この缶詰、対策された缶詰。
Yes, I can. Yeah. So I think something's wrong with the. Is there any labeling? Is there any labeling? Is the question. Yes, there is. It says BPA free, which unfortunately doesn't differentiate it from many other false product substitutes, which are BPA free but haven't been tested. Testing is necessary, and you have to test at low doses. You cannot assume safety. For centuries we have assumed safety, and we've been fooled. Now we know we need to test using modern tools. That's the basic message of this paper.
ありがとうございました。ではそろそろお時間となりましたので、一旦このセッションを終わりたいと思います。次は35分から再開とします。ではマイヤーズ博士に温かい拍手をお願いします。